Mountain States Foundation and the International Storytelling Center present Stories for the Soul. And now, recorded live from the International Storytelling Center in historic Jonesborough, Tennessee, Bill Jones.
Well, I was a Presbyterian minister for 31 years, and I began using stories in the ministry. And I noticed when I'd go into storytelling, people who were kind of drifting off at the sermon would start waking up and paying attention, and I thought that was really neat. Then I began teaching storytelling in Sunday school classes and getting people in the congregation to tell stories, and I realized how important they are. And I just began to take workshops so I could learn how to do it better, and one thing led to another, and I eventually retired from ministry, and now I'm telling stories. I love going into schools and working with like 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders and telling them stories and getting them to tell me what they see in their minds as I'm telling the story is always fun, because they always bring so much to the story. They see things I didn't even mention. And then all the time I'm training them how to do this, and then I go back and ask them to tell me their stories. And to hear the kinds of stories that 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders come up with about things that have happened in their lives, I think it's just really neat to see children that age think about what's happened in their lives and what it meant to them and put that into a story. Television is full of stories, but those stories aren't always our stories. And our children and grandchildren need to know what it was like when we were their age, and how we related to our parents, and how we discovered the world around us. I just think that's a very important thing for people to do in families and among friends.
Bill Jones is our teller this week, and we've had a great time with him. But he first discovered the power of storytelling while serving as a Presbyterian minister. And since retiring from the ministry, he's focused on telling stories about being a parent, about being a pastor, about being a wilderness canoe guide. And his stories will make you laugh, they'll make you cry, they'll make you think. And so I am glad that Bill has been with us this week, and I hope that you will welcome him and enjoy him today. Bill.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks for that introduction. It's been wonderful being here this week. I was a minister in Kingsport, Tennessee first back in the 1970s, then moved over to Johnson City, Tennessee for 11 years through the 80s. And now we live in Memphis, so it's been like coming home to be here this week. It's been so much fun, and in fact, a couple of our kids who now live in San Francisco and Boston have flown their wives in to show them where they grew up, and so it's been a fun week for us on lots of different levels. I tell stories about my own life, as Charles said to you. What I hope happens is I can invite you into the landscape of my life and let you visit with me there and bring with you your own memories and pictures in your mind. And if my stories remind you of anything, please tell somebody about that, especially somebody in a different generation from you, because our kids and our grandkids need to know what it was like when we were growing up. With that in mind, here's a story about when I was a little boy growing up in Talladega, Alabama. Sometimes I got sick. Sometimes I got a headache. You know, the kind of headache that hurts so bad you don't even want to move your head. Sometimes I got a sore throat, the kind of sore throat that it's hard to swallow. You can't talk. Sometimes I got that other kind of sick. You know what I mean? My mama called it upchucking. But it felt like my insides were coming out. The thing is, when I got sick, my mama didn't take me to a doctor's office. She didn't put me in a car, and we didn't go to a minor medical center. Nope. She put me in bed, And she went to the telephone and she called Dr. Toole, and sooner or later I would hear the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. I'd hear a car door slam. I'd hear a voice, a man's voice out in the house, and pretty soon Dr. Toole would be standing there right beside my bed. He'd look down at me and he'd say, "How are you?" And I'd say, "I'm sick." And he'd say, "Well, I've got to check you over." And Dr. Toole would take his little black bag that he'd brought along with him and he'd put it on the side of the bed and he'd open it up and he'd start taking things out of that to check me over with. I knew the things he was going to take out of there because I'd been sick before. I'd been checked over before. And I knew that 3 of them were going to be okay, but there was another one that I was going to hate. First thing he'd take out of there would probably be like a flashlight with a little funnel on top. And he'd look in my ears with that, and maybe in my eyes. And then he'd put that back in his black bag. I didn't mind that. Then he took out something that looked like it used to have the world's biggest popsicle on it. But the popsicle was gone, and all that was left was the stick. And he'd say, "Open up and say, ah." And I'd open up and he'd lay that right on the back of my tongue. And if my problem was upchucking, I'm thinking, "You're treading on dangerous territory, but at least you'll be the first to see it coming." When he finished with that, he didn't put that back in his black bag, because if he did that, he might use it again. He'd stick that in his coat pocket so he'd remember to throw it away. Then he'd take out a little round metal thing with tubes coming out of it that went to his ears. I learned later that was called a stethoscope. And he'd lay that on my chest and listen to me breathe and listen to my heart. Sometimes he'd put it on my back and listen to me breathe back there, and it was cold. Then he'd roll that up, put that back in his black bag, and I was okay so far, but I knew it was coming. Sooner or later, he'd reach in that black bag, pull something out, and start shaking it. Kids today, when I tell this story, they don't understand. They didn't used to take our temperature in our ears. No, I knew what he was about to say, and I was dreading it, and he'd say it. "Roll over." And I didn't want to. But even as a little child, I was learning, sometimes you have to do things, whether you really want to or not. And I'd roll over and he'd stick it in and take my temperature. One time he pulled that out of there and he started shaking it down, and I thought, "Oh no, here it comes." He didn't say roll over. He said, "Do you think you're old enough to hold this thermometer under your tongue for a minute without biting it?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I can do that. And he put it in my mouth and I held it under my tongue with my lips. I did not touch it with my teeth. If I'd been in a different frame of mind, I might have been thinking, I wonder where that thermometer's been. But I wasn't thinking about that at all. I was thinking, I'm growing up. After he finished checking me over, then he'd start taking things out of that black bag to make me better with. And this was bad too. He might pull out a bottle of medicine, white, chalky medicine. He'd send my mama off for a tablespoon and give me some of it, and I didn't want to take it, but I had to. And that was better than the other thing he might pull out of there. If it wasn't medicine, it was going to be a shot. And if it was a shot, chances are he was about to say those same two words. Roll over. And I didn't want to, but I was learning even as a child. Sometimes you just have to do things, whether you really want to or not. The thing is, sometimes I got shots when I wasn't even sick. Once a year, in the spring, every year, I had to go to Dr. Toole's office for my typhoid shot. And I just hated it because it hurt. Not once, but twice. It hurt when the nurse stuck it in my arm, and then about 2 or 3 hours later, my shoulder would start to heat up and turn red and swell up and hurt and ache, and it would ache for about 2 days. My mama would pick me up from school one day. After school, she'd say, "We're going to Dr. Toole's office for your typhoid shot." It'd just ruin a perfectly good spring day. Well, when I was about 11 years old, my mama changed the rules. My sister Patsy was 6 years older than me. She was driving me to school now. My mama said at breakfast, "Patsy, you and Bill are old enough to go get your typhoid shots without me being there. Patsy, you pick up Bill after school, just drive down to Dr. Toole's office." That meant I had all day to think about it. And I was sitting there in school thinking about it. And by 3 o'clock that afternoon, I had come to a decision. I am not getting my typhoid shot today. Patsy picked me up after school. We drove to Dr. Toole's office. We were sitting in the waiting room, and I was looking around thinking, my mama, she's really here. But she wasn't. The nurse called us back into the room there where they gave you shots and things, and she said as we were going in there, "Are you here for your typhoid boosters?" And my sister Patsy said, "Yes, ma'am." And I said, "No, ma'am." And that nurse stopped and said, "You're not going to give me any trouble, are you?" And I said, "No, ma'am. I'm just not here for my typhoid booster." She said, "Well, come on in anyway." And she said, "You know, sometimes grown-ups can say things that aren't real smart." She said, "Oh, it won't hurt." Like I didn't already know. But she wasn't done yet, dipping into the stupid pool. She went even deeper. She said, "I tell you what we'll do. We'll give Patsy her shot first." Like watching a needle go in my sister's arm is going to make me want to say, "Oh, I want one too." No. Patsy took her shot like it didn't even hurt. She just stood there. She was so brave. But while she was doing it, I was looking around the room. That nurse turned around to get my needle. And I'd noticed there was a table right there in the middle of the room. You know, the kind with the paper on it? And I had already figured it out. I was only 11 years old, but I had math, and I could figure it out, geometry and all that kind of thing. There was one of her and one of me and a table. There was no way in the world she could give me that shot as long as I was on the other side of the table. So I was on the other side of the table. She turned around with that shot, and she saw me there, and she started around the table. Well, I just started around the table, too. And she came on around after me, and we just kept going around the table about 3 times. We weren't running. You remember that O.J. Simpson chase on the freeway, about 45 miles an hour? It was about like that. We were just walking around when she finally stopped. And she said, "I don't think you're in the mood for your shot today. Why don't you go home and come back another time?" I couldn't believe it. I had won against a grown-up in a uniform. And then I went home, and my mama found out I hadn't had my typhoid shot, and she was not pleased. I could tell she was not pleased because she said, "Young man," and when she said that, she was not pleased. "Tomorrow, I am picking you up from school, and you are going to Dr. Toole's office and get your typhoid shot whether you want it or not." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And the next day, I went in and held out my arm and took my shot because I was learning even as a child. Sometimes you have to do things, whether you really want to or not. The thing is, thanks to all these shots, I grew up. And when I was in high school, I had the manliest job in the whole world. In the summers, I was a canoe guide for the Minnesota Outward Bound School. I could pick up a canoe, a 17-foot Grumman aluminum canoe by myself, put it on my shoulders, and carry it over a mile portage without putting it down. I could paddle upwind all day in a canoe without stopping. I could light a fire in a driving rain with one match. I had a manly job. So I got ready to go off to college, and they send you this medical form you got to get filled out. My mama said, we need to go down to Dr. Toole's office to get that filled out. I said to my mama, no, you don't need to take me to Dr. Toole's office to get that filled out. I'm a man. I can go do that myself. So I drove myself down there, and they took that form and put in when I'd had chicken pox and all those things and everything. Gave me the shots I needed, no problem. I thought I was through when the nurse turned around with a needle like I had never seen before. It was bigger than the ones they gave you a shot with. And you know the part of the needle, the shot down here where the medicine goes, that didn't have anything in it. Yet. Nurse said I need to take a little blood. And she said it'll be just a little stick. And she started cleaning off my arm with alcohol. And that's the point when I decided, now it would not be unmanly if I studied the wall over here for a few minutes. So I turned and just studied the wall, and there was a little stick, and it didn't hurt too much, and then she put cotton on it, and I held it up, and then she put a Band-Aid on it, and she said, you're finished now, you can go. And I stood up. Some of you may know what is about to happen. The door was right there. And I took a step toward the door, but just as I did, it sort of drifted. And I kind of stepped over here to catch it, and it drifted back, and I stepped back. And the next thing I knew, I was sitting back down in that chair. My head was down between my knees, and there was a cold washcloth on the back of my neck. I had fainted. I was coming to and thinking, how manly was that? The nurse said, don't worry about it. It happens all the time. You'll be fine. And I was pretty soon, and I got up and left and went off and had no more problems. Went off to college. I went to Davidson College. It was an all-male school back in the 1960s. And back in the 1960s, it was a little different than it is now when you go off to college, I think. First 2 years you're there, they tell you every class you have to take. Don't get to choose anything. Had to take English, math, science, history, all those things. And I had to take something, we all had to take something called ROTC, Training for the Army. This was back in the days of the draft, and we were all going to be drafted, so all the Davidson students had to take 2 years of ROTC. Then the ones who were really serious could take 2 more years, and when they got drafted, they'd go in as a lieutenant. The thing was, I was not going in the Army, because even though there was a draft, I had a special deferment because I was going into the ministry. They had this special deferment for crazy people, felons, and ministers. So I wasn't going in the Army, but I still had to take 2 years of ROTC. And I didn't really mind it because it was pretty easy. I could make an A, but there was one part of it I just hated. Every Tuesday afternoon, we had drill. And it took all afternoon because we had to polish our brass buttons with brass soap, polish our brass belt buckle. We had to spit shine our shoes so that when they inspected us, they could look down and see their faces in them. Then we had to go down and check out the M1 rifle they'd issued to us. It wouldn't shoot. So I couldn't see how it ever got dirty, but we had to clean it every week, take it apart, clean it, and then we had to go out and march around for about 2 hours and stand at attention and be inspected and be yelled at. What makes you think you can be in the Army? You look like you just got out of bed. I just hated it. Every Tuesday morning I woke up and thought, oh no, it's Tuesday. One day a friend of mine and I were walking across campus. There was a sign up. It had a red cross on it. Bloodmobile, it said. Gave the dates and the times, and at the bottom it said, all ROTC students who donate blood are exempt from drill that week. I said to my friend, I'm doing that. He said, you know they use needles. I said, I don't care, I'm doing that anyway. He said, the last time they were here, half the football team fainted. I said, I don't care, I've done that. I went and got in line for the bloodmobile. I got up to this little nurse who was checking us in. She took one look at me. I looked like I was about 12 years old. She said, "You're not old enough to give blood." I pulled out my driver's license, showed it to her. I was 19 years old. She said, "You don't weigh enough to give blood. You have to weigh 110 pounds. I said, "I weigh 115. I've got 5 to spare." She said, "Oh, I just don't think we should take your blood." I said, "I don't want to go to drill. Take my blood." And I went and laid down on that cot they had and gave blood, and I sat up when I finished and drank Coca-Cola, and I ate cookies, and I stood up, and the door stayed right where it was supposed to, and I walked out, didn't even feel faint. And every time the bloodmobile came to Davidson College for 2 years, I gave blood. My junior year, a friend and I were walking across campus, saw one of those signs, Red Cross. We both said, "Oh, it's a good thing we don't have to do that anymore, isn't it?" Because we weren't in ROTC anymore. And we said, "Yeah." But on the day of the bloodmobile, do you know what happened? My feet didn't get the message. And I found my feet walking me right over there in that line, and I went and gave blood anyway. And all I can figure is it must have been because in the process of growing up, I had learned sometimes you just have to do things whether you really want to or not because they're the right thing to do. Thank you. When I was a little boy growing up in Talladega, Alabama, we used to have encyclopedias that came in books. Remember those? We had Compton's encyclopedias, and I loved to read because I was real little. And I couldn't play the sports like some of the other kids did quite as well, so I loved to read, and I'd get those encyclopedias down, and I found out that my very favorite one, I still remember this, was the B volume. And the reason was because of 2 articles in there that I just loved. One was on beavers. I was fascinated with beavers. Here were these animals that could build dams and change the course of rivers. You know, when I was a little boy, we'd go on picnics sometimes down by streams, and after we'd eaten, I'd go down and start trying to dam up the stream. I mean, that's just what little boys do when they're by streams, isn't it? I'd roll rocks in there and pile up mud and sticks and everything, but it never, ever made any difference in the flow of the stream. And here was a rodent that could do it. And I was fascinated with that, and they could build houses out in the middle of the lake with underwater entrances so that the wolves and things couldn't get them. And I read in there and found out that also when the baby beavers were born, they were so buoyant that they couldn't swim underwater. So they couldn't get out of the house till Mama and Daddy were ready for them to. I thought that was so cool. And the other article I liked so much was bears. I loved the article about bears. They had great pictures, polar bears, white, running across white landscapes, and great grizzly bears with those silver shoulders, and black bears scratching against the trees, and a picture of the cars lined up at Yellowstone Park. All the cars looking at the bears lined up beside the road, looking at the cars, just looking at each other. And right in the middle of the article on bears was a color cartoon story about bears. It was about a mama bear and a bear cub. And the bear cub would not behave and kept getting in trouble, and the mama bear would go to whatever extremes were necessary to rescue her cub. I just loved that. And I learned from that. Never get between a mama bear and her cub. That wouldn't be safe. When I got to be 11 years old, I joined the Boy Scouts. I thought, that'll be cool. I can go camping and look for beavers and bears. But my troop didn't go camping anywhere very exotic. We only went to Pinckney Whitson's farm. We'd go back to the back pasture and we'd camp there. The only animals I ever saw were cows. We had little pup tents. They showed us how to put them up, and they showed us how to dig the trenches around them so if it rained, the water wouldn't go in. And we'd put up our pup tents and dig the little trenches. And one night, I was lying in my pup tent with Bob Burton right beside us. We got waked up by this storm came through in the middle of the night. Thunder, lightning, and it was just pouring down rain. And they told us, If you touch the inside of a pup tent in the rain, it'll leak. Now, why would anybody tell an 11-year-old boy that? Only one reason. Bob Burton and I are lying there saying, that wouldn't happen. They just made that up. That wouldn't happen, would it? He said, touch it and see. I said, no, you touch it. He said, okay, and he reached up over me and touched it. And we were sitting there looking at it and said, see, nothing happened. And then a little drop of water formed. And it dripped down on my sleeping bag, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one. But it didn't really matter, because you remember those trenches I told you we dug around there? That was collecting the water from all over the pasture and just running it in under the tent anyway. We were lying in about this much water. So it got to be that I decided I really didn't like Boy Scouts that much, didn't like the camping that much, and I dropped out of Boy Scouts. And I just decided that's not my thing. Well, some years later, I was off at a boarding school, and this man named Bob Pay, I just really got to be where I liked his family. I would eat my meals at his table in the dining room. He had a daughter named Wendy Pay, who was 1 year younger than me. And she was going through these miraculous changes by the day. And I didn't want to miss a day of seeing it. So I'd eat my meals at their table, and I got to know these people very well. And one day, Bob Pay had said he was inviting a bunch of people over that weekend, that Sunday night, to make pizza at his house and see slides of a canoe trip that he was going to take the next summer with some boys from down there in Alabama up in Canada. Going to be a long 19-day canoe trip in the wilderness. Well, I knew I wasn't too interested in the canoe trip, but the pizza and Wendy sounded pretty good. So I said, I'll be there. And we made pizza, and we ate pizza, and we watched these slides, and they were very pretty. But when it was over, I left and said, you know, camping, I've just learned, camping is really not my thing. I don't believe I'll go. A couple of weeks later, I went home for the weekend. Now, my mama had known about that night. And something happened while I was home that weekend, and you may have had an experience like this in your life too, where you look back on it and you say, why did that happen? There's just no logical explanation for it. And this is one of those moments in my life. I was home that weekend, and my mama just out of the blue said, you look like something's bothering you. Have you been thinking about that canoe trip? Would you really like to go on that canoe trip? Now, that's not the part that's really so hard for me to understand, because you see, my mama was worried about me because I was little. My mama used to give me milkshakes every night with raw eggs stirred in them just to help me grow up, but they didn't work. I knew she was worried about me, and I knew I could understand, because my mama was this kind of woman. She could manipulate you into doing what she wanted you to do, and I understood she thought this trip might make a man out of me. The part I can't understand is my answer that came jumping out of my mouth. I have no idea why I said this, but I said, yes, ma'am, I'd like to do that. Before I'd even finished that sentence, she'd written the check. Give this to Mr. Pay when you get back to school this Sunday night. And I did, and he looked real pleased that I was going. And so it came to pass that summer, I found myself at a train station in Birmingham, Alabama, with a bunch of other guys from that area who were going up to the northern border of Minnesota to cross over into Canada on a 19-day canoe trip. My mama put a little pill in my hand. It was a Dramamine, in case I needed it on the train. And I got on the train, and that night they made up a little bed for me, and I was lying on that little bed. I was looking out the window at the houses going by. You know how they look at night, where the windows look kind of orange with the light inside, and I saw mamas washing dishes at their windows, and I started to feel sort of sick, but it was not a kind of sick that Dramamine was going to help. What am I doing here, I was saying. Bob Pay met us up in Superior, Wisconsin, drove us way on up into the woods to his camp, and I got to that camp, and I looked at the lake, and I looked at the canoes, nested there on the shore beside the lake, and I promise you this is the first time this thought had crossed my mind in this whole adventure. I thought to myself, Bill Jones, you have never even been in a canoe. And you are about to go on a 19-day canoe trip in the wilderness. Bob Pay spent the next 3 or 4 days teaching us how to pitch the tents and how to handle the canoes, and at the end, he gave us a little test. He got out in a canoe on the lake, and he had us paddle straight toward him. And he said, now at the last minute, I'm going to holler either left or right, and you use those nifty little strokes that I've taught you how to do to turn your canoe the right way. So my turn came, and I'm paddling the canoe as hard as I can right toward his canoe, and he hollered left. And of course, I looked down at my arms to see which arm my watch was on, so I would know which was my left hand. And I'd left my watch on the shore. So I had to think about it. Okay, this is my left hand. By then, crash, I had banged into his canoe. The next day, he loaded us all up in several station wagons, pulling several canoes with all of our food for the next 19 days, all of our tents, all of our clothes. We drove to the very end of the road. This is what they mean when they say the word end of the road. This was it. We were going to a roadless area. The road stopped at a lake. We got in, we loaded up the canoes, and then Bob Pay started assigning us all to canoes. And I was the last one he assigned. I was going to be sitting in the middle of his canoe. His son was at Duke University. He was our assistant guide. He was in the front. Bob Pay was in the back, and I was sitting on a pack in the middle. I knew what he was thinking. This little boy won't make it without a lot of help. Now, he believed that even the person in the middle of the canoe is supposed to paddle too. So we started up Moose Lake, and I'm sitting in the canoe, and I start paddling with one thought in my head. I am going to show him that I can do this. And I was digging in the water with that paddle. And about 10 minutes later, I was thinking, if this arm over here doesn't fall off, I don't know what's going to happen, and I've got to do this for 19 days. When he hollered switch, and we got to switch and paddle on this side, I thought maybe I can make it. And 10 minutes later, I'm thinking, now this arm is going to fall off. I can't do this. We finally reached land, and I thought, oh, thank you, Lord. We've reached land. I can walk. We got out on the land. Bob Pay picked up one of the packs. These packs stood about half of my height and weighed about 2/3 of my weight. He picked up one of the packs. He said, put this on. He put it on, and I went, womp. Just like this, and this is mostly what I saw on all the portages that summer, was just the trail down in front of me. But I'd start looking up after about 5 minutes, where's the water? Where's the water? And I'd get to the other and roll over like a turtle and slip out of that. Oh, thank goodness we're back to water. And then we got on the water and we started paddling again. But after you've done that a few hours, you know, you stop thinking about how much it hurts. And we got to the first campsite up on a rock, a high rock, and we went swimming, and we had a good supper, and then the loons came swimming in. Now, some of you may know about loons. They look like ducks, but don't let anybody fool you. They're not ducks. They don't quack. They go, whoo! And one of the guys in our group could do that. And he started calling them in, and they came swimming in. Woo-hoo! That was really neat. And then the sun started going down, and we sat there thinking, we could go 100 miles in any direction except the one we've just come from and not run into a road or a house or a telephone pole or anything man-made. It was an amazing feeling. And as the next few days began to happen, I began to hurt less. I was still portaging like this, but I could do it, and we began to see things like we'd come around a corner and there'd be a deer standing there. We came down one stream, we were coming down, we looked over there was a moose standing up to her belly in the water, big nose underwater, pulling up mouthfuls of green stuff to eat. It was amazing. We learned how to bake cakes out over a fire. We got to Pooh Bah Lake, and we were fishing and caught a 19-pound northern pike. It was great. We ate that We were not hungry that night. We saw something swimming across the lake, and it was a deer, and we paddled out and kind of paddled along with it as the deer swam across the lake. That was on Pooh-Bah Lake, right up in the middle of the wilderness. Nice thing about Pooh-Bah Lake is it was real remote. The easy way in was up a creek. If you didn't want to go back out the same way you'd come in, you had to take the hard way out. Of course, we were not going back the same way we'd come in. The hard way out involved 3 portages, each one a mile long, separated by what was called a pothole, which is a little body of water you can paddle across in about 3 minutes. So basically it was a 3-mile portage out of this lake. And we got out onto the very beginning of the portage and sank up to our knees in mud. This is going to be a long day, we said. And it was. It was muddy, and it was long, and I was going along like this, watching, and I had a really good view of something very interesting. Because as I was walking at one point on this portage, on a grassy part of the trail, I noticed every time I stepped, the grass kind of went out in waves, like that. And I realized this whole thing is growing on top of muck or something that's watery down under there, and I thought, that's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Pretty soon I noticed there's a canoe bottom side up in the trail right in front of me. I thought, that's interesting. I wonder who was carrying that. And I walked off the trail on the grass, kind of walked around it, and I heard this voice saying, "Get this thing off me!" Well, that was easy because I was already down there, see? And I just rolled it over, and he was up to about here. He'd broken through the trail and through the grass, and had just sunk down, right down all the way to the bottom. I left him there to get himself out because I wasn't much help, and went on. But by the time we got to the end of that mile-long portage, everybody in our group had mud in their shirt pockets. It was a long, hard day, so we took the first campsite we could find after that. The problem with the first campsite we could find after that was it had enough tent sites for all of our tents except one. Bob Pace said, that's not a problem, because see that little island right over there? I bet we can go find a spot on that island that's flat enough and big enough for at least the 2 smallest people in the group. That was me and Howard. So he paddled us over there with our pack, and we found this little spot that we could both barely fit on, and we spent the night there on that island. Next morning we packed everything up, paddled it over to the main campsite. We put the pack out, because you never pull a canoe up on the ground with the packs in it. Put the pack out, pulled the canoe up, went and ate breakfast with everybody, and then they got all the canoes down there, brought all the packs down there, loaded them all up, and we went paddling off. About 3 hours down that lake, and then we came to a series of small lakes with portages between them, and finally we came to our next campsite. Started unloading the packs at the next campsite. Howard and I are looking around. Where's our personal pack? Mr. Pace said to the group, everybody had the same number of packs today that we had yesterday, didn't you? One canoe said, no, we had one less pack today because we just got rid of a food pack, remember? He said that pack came out of our canoe. We had left our personal pack all the way back at the last campsite. We ate an early, quick supper, and Mr. Pace said, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask one person to just go back with me, and we'll go get that pack. And while we were eating supper, he came over to me. He said, would you go back with me to get that pack? And I thought to myself, first of all, I thought, I've got to do everything I've already done today backwards. But the second thing I thought was, he thinks I can do it. I showed him. I said, sure, I'll go back. And as soon as we finished eating, we got in an empty canoe and started paddling. Now, the goal was to get over all those portages before full darkness set in. Well, the portages were easy now. First time in my life I could walk across the portage like this because we didn't have a pack. It was back at the end. We got over that last portage just as full darkness settled in, and we pushed out onto that lake. About 3 more hours to go. He said, now, this is night paddling. This is special. Let's be real quiet and not talk. So we started paddling up that lake, and the stars came out. The lake was mirror smooth. Every star overhead, you could see the Milky Way, and every star overhead was reflected in the surface of that lake. I was sitting up in the bow of that canoe, and it felt like I was floating through the universe. It was amazing. And then the Northern Lights came out. What is that? He said, that's the Northern Lights, and we sat there. We couldn't even paddle then. We just sat there and watched these curtains of silver and color moving across the sky. It was just amazing. And then a big old moon came up over the horizon, and that kind of dimmed out the Northern Lights. So now we had a trail in front of us on the lake from the moon that the moon laid down there, and we're paddling up that lake, up that trail toward that campsite. And I started watching the fireflies over on the shore. You know how late at night the Stephen King part of your mind can come to life? And I'm watching these fireflies, and I notice this one light that keeps kind of following us at the shore. It looks like it blinks, but it's like somebody, I imagined it was somebody carrying a flashlight, and they're walking behind the trees, you know, but it would always come right back on. And here is this light following us, and I kept watching it thinking it's just a firefly, but no, it keeps following us. And I thought, that can't be good out here in the middle of the wilderness. Should I tell him? And I finally decided to tell him. And at the very instant that I was opening my mouth to say something about that, wham! About 10 feet in front of us, it felt like and sounded like somebody had thrown a boulder into the lake, and I nearly wet my pants. And he jumped too. And then he said, "Beaver." I said, "Beavers!" And all the rest of the way up to that campsite, they were splashing their tails on the lake in front of us, and we were close to them. Some of them so close you could see it in the moonlight, the water splashing up. And we finally got up to that campsite. Our pack was there. We put the tent up, and he slept in Howard's sleeping bag, and I slept in mine. The next day we got up and we redid the whole thing. Plus, the group had moved on. So we got to that place, and we started down about 2 more portages. When we got to the very last portage, it went up over a little hill, and then it went for about a half mile down through the woods. Mr. Pay put the pack on my back, and I started up the hill just like that. I got right up to the top of the hill, and I was eye to eye with a bear. And I stopped, and it went running off. And Mr. Pay came up behind me, and he said, "Why you stopped? Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, but there was a bear right there." And he said, "Oh, cool. Was it a big one or a little one?" And I said, "No, it was just a little bitty one." And he said, "Oh, good. The mama's probably around here somewhere." And he took off with the canoe on his back and disappeared, and left me standing there with this pack, thinking I'm between a cub and a mama. And I listened. I was by myself on that trail all the way back down, and I was listening for every sound. And you cannot imagine how much sound a squirrel can make in the woods when you are listening for it. There were noises all the way down there, but I never saw the bear again. We got to the other group and told them about our adventures and went on out. And the last day we got up, and it was raining. It was not the first rain we'd had, so we learned what you do on a canoe trip when it rains. You get wet, and you just don't mind it. But we're going along. We got our ponchos on. The last morning we're paddling out of that wilderness, and I thought, I might have missed this. I pulled the hood of my poncho down off so I could hear the sound of the rain on the lake, and I listened to the sound of my paddle pulling through the water, and I thought, I almost did not do this. I am so thankful I did this. And about 2 days later, I got home in Alabama, and I was lying in my own bed in my own room looking out the window, and the moon came up. And when I saw that moon, I felt the strangest feeling. Lying in my own bed, in my own home, I felt homesick. thank you. One last little story to think about as we close up our time here together. About 12 years or so ago, we were living in Memphis, Tennessee. I was a minister there. The phone rang one Thursday night. It was Gert. Gert is the woman we had employed since my mother had died and my father was kind of going downhill. She was the woman we had employed to live with my father and take care of him. Gert called on Thursday night after dinner to say, Mr. George is real sick. I think you better come home. Now, this came right out of the blue. I had not expected to hear this. My father was a strong man. I knew he was going downhill, but I didn't know he'd been sick. He had lived all of his life taking care of people, and the last person he took care of was my mama, who was declining in health, and he took care of her, and when she died, he ran out of people to take care of. And now he was having to be taken care of. And when Gert called, I had to make a decision. It was about a 5-hour drive from our house, in Memphis down to our house in Talladega, Alabama. This was a smaller house that my parents had moved into in their older age. I had to decide, do I leave right now and get down there about 2 o'clock in the morning, or do I wait and get up about 5 in the morning and leave and go down and see him? And being a minister, I couldn't just up and leave on a Thursday night because the weekend was coming. So I had to make a few calls and let people know and arrange for things, and by the time I'd done that, I realized how late it would be if I got there, and I decided, for better or worse, I'm going to sleep a little bit tonight, get up in the morning and go down. As I was driving across Mississippi the next morning in the dawn light, I was thinking about my father. And I was thinking to myself, I know that my father knows I love him. And I know I love my father. So if I don't get there in time to see him one more time, it'll be okay. Well, I was driving along and remembering this man who had been there for me all my life. This strong, small man, my father. Before I was born, he and his brother owned and operated a resort outside of Talladega called Chaco Springs. And he had hired my mother to be the bookkeeper there for him, and his story was she was so bad at it, he had to marry her. So he married her, and they had my two older sisters while they were still there. My father was well known in our hometown, and anybody who knew my father would know certain things about him. One thing they'd know about him was that he smoked a pipe. He always smoked a pipe. He did not take the pipe out of his mouth to talk. He would hold on to the bowl of it and clench it with his teeth and talk to you like this, and so people were always leaning into him to try to understand what he was saying. He always was working on that pipe, keeping that pipe going. I have seen my father kiss my mother with that pipe coming out of the side of his mouth. Another thing they'd know about him was he was a great businessman. My father could take anything and make something of it. My father would do investments, and he would not only chart the progress of the investments that he'd made, but he would think about the ones that he didn't make when he chose to make that one, and he would chart those to see how well he'd done. My father left me 2 pieces of advice. If you tailgate long enough, sooner or later you're going to run into something. And diversify. Another thing that you'd know about my father if you ever knew him was he was a hard-working man. My father ran an insurance agency after the war. Oh, let me go back and tell you about his war experience. When the war came along, he and his brother sold Chaco Springs, and he went into the Army Air Force. He went into basic training in Miami, Florida. He was in basic training with Clark Gable and Bobby Jones, the golfer. When he finished basic training, the commanding officer called him in and said, Mr. Jones, I see from your record you've done a very fine job here. But there is something about your record that I don't understand, and I wonder if you could explain it to me. You're the only person ever to go through basic training here and gain weight. And my father says, he said to that man, "Frankly, sir, I found it restful." He was a hard-working man. After the war, he and another brother co-owned an insurance agency, Talladega Insurance Agency. Insure, insure, insurance was the motto. And he worked there. He was always gone in the morning from before I ever woke up. He got up in the morning and fixed himself breakfast before anybody else. He was gone, but he was always home in the afternoon at 5 minutes after 5. We moved out to a farm between my second and third grade, and I decided the reason we did that was so he'd have something to do, a second job. Once he got home at 5 in the afternoon, he would grow everything on that farm, and he would work hard on that farm till after the sun had set. And of course, when I started growing up, one of his jobs was to make me as hardworking as he was. So in the summertime, when I was home on the farm, I always knew to play and watch television in the morning. Because when he came home for lunch, he was going to have me some chores to have done by the time he got home at 5. And one of the chores that was his favorite to give me was to pull up the nut grass. My father ran a lifelong war against nut grass. I don't know what you know about nut grass, but you're about to find out something about it. Nut grass is a perfectly, as far as I could tell, respectable green grass that comes out of the ground. I had nothing against nut grass, but my daddy did. You go down to a root, and on the root there was a nut. Right there you got a problem, because when you're pulling it up, it's pulling back. Out of that nut, all sorts of other roots are going off in all directions, putting out other nuts, sending up more nut grass. My theory was that if I was good enough, I could get over one piece of nut grass and start pulling and have every piece of nut grass in Talladega County come up right at my feet. But I was not good enough, and especially because the place my father hated nut grass was growing up between the bricks and the brick walk around our farmhouse. He'd see one little bit of green coming up there, and at lunchtime he'd say, "I want you to get all the nut grass out of there." And that meant an ice pick or a screwdriver or something to get down there to try to get under that nut, because if you didn't get the nut, it didn't matter. You know, and it meant bloody knuckles. It was hard work. Of course, it wasn't all hard work on the farm. We had fun, too. Sometimes we made homemade ice cream. Of course, there was no electric ice cream makers for us because we were hard-working people. So you had to crank it, you know, and you'd put the ice in with the salt so it'd get, it would melt below. It would be still slushy below 32 degrees, and you'd turn it. When you finish, you'd lift that canister out carefully so you wouldn't get any of that salt water in it. And then my daddy would go empty the salty water. One time when I was old enough, my daddy said, "You go empty the salty water." But then he said, "Now be careful. Don't pour it anywhere where something's growing, because that salt water will kill anything that's growing." That was a great day in my life. After that, every time I saw anything green coming up between those bricks, salt water on it. My daddy never saw anything green. He didn't give me that job to do anymore. But he taught me how to drive the tractor. As soon as my legs were long enough to reach the clutch, I can still feel the feel of him standing on the back of that tractor, reaching around me, helping me learn how to drive that tractor. I can still feel the feeling of sitting in his lap on Friday nights watching the Gillette Friday night fights with my daddy. I was remembering these things as I was driving across Mississippi and Alabama that morning, thinking, if I don't get home in time, it's okay. But feeling, oh, I sure hope I do. As soon as I pulled up at the house, I went in and I saw Gert. She was sitting on the sofa in the den. And the minute I saw her sitting there, I knew I was too late. Because she wouldn't be sitting on the sofa. If he was still alive, she'd be taking care of him. She said he died about 8 o'clock this morning. My wife already knew because they'd called home in Memphis. My sister Alice in Nashville already knew because she'd called them. They were on the way down. But I arrived and didn't know. His body, she said, the doctor came and pronounced him dead. They've got his body at the funeral home. I didn't know what to say, so I said I'd like to go see the room where he was, where was his room. And I went and I stood in the door of that room. We had gotten him a hospital bed. We'd rented it. In a small town, things happen quickly. They had already come and taken the bed out of that room. I looked in that empty room of his, and I felt like this chasm was opening up in front of me, and I held on to the door so I didn't fall into it. Pretty soon, though, people started arriving, you know, church, neighborhood, with food and stories. Pretty soon, my sister Alice came, and my wife came, and we started doing things. This was the first time we'd ever been in our parents' house with both of them dead now. Everything in that house now belonged to us. We started looking around at all the things there, and my sister Alice said, "Where's Daddy's army trunk? Your kids and my kids, they'd like some of the stuff in that army trunk." We started looking for that army trunk. We looked everywhere we could think. We pulled the steps down to the attic and climbed up there. There's just a small part of the attic was floored above our bedrooms, and none of the rest of it was even floored, and there were just a few things up there, no army trunk. Alice kept getting madder and madder, and the person she was getting mad at was our mama. Our mama, when Alice went off to college, threw away Alice's comic book collection. And Alice never forgave her for that. She said, "That woman threw away his army stuff. I just know it." We went to bed that night and slept in the bedrooms in our parents' house the first time ever without them on this earth. The next morning we got up and we met in the hall, and Alice said, "Did you hear it?" I said, "What?" She said, "Somebody was walking around the attic last night." I said, "No, I didn't hear it. And nobody could be walking in the attic because they'd have had to pull these steps down right between our two bedroom doors. They would have waked us up." She said, "I don't care. I heard it." And furthermore, she said, they were walking down that end of the house toward the kitchen and the carport. And I said, "They couldn't have been. There's no floor there." And then I said, "But I wonder about the carport." And we went out and we looked up at the ceiling of the carport, and for the first time ever, I noticed a little cutout in the corner of the ceiling where you could lift off a piece. And I said, "There might be something up there." And we went and got the step ladder, and I climbed up there and lifted that off and shined a flashlight, and I said to Alice, "There's only one thing up here. The army trunk." Now, I can't tell you what the footsteps were. All I can tell you is this: when we find ourselves standing at the edge of the abyss and feeling like we're about to fall in, life has a way of helping us back. Thank you.
This video series is brought to you by the Mountain States Foundation in conjunction with the International Storytelling Center of Jonesborough, Tennessee. For more information about the International Storytelling Center, call area code 423-753-2171 or online at www.storytellingcenter.net.